Welcome to another episode of From Print to Pod. This is Dr. Donna Coriel. I'm the host, and today we're going to be interviewing Dr. Drew Remignanti. And and it's based on his interview called A Writer Interview with Dr. Drew Remignanti on the Healing Connection. Dr. Remignanti, welcome. Would you like to quickly introduce yourself?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm a retired emergency physician, and towards the end of my career, I was very alarmed at the trajectory of the United States healthcare system, which is why I wrote my book.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Okay, let's dive right into the first question, and that's about building a foundation. Your book is supported by over 280 scientific references. How did you curate and organize these resources to create a narrative that's both rigorous and accessible?
I started, I passed my emergency medicine boards for the fourth time in 2014. And that's when I thought I got to start thinking about an end game. Because when I needed to take the exam again in 2024, I was going to be 71. I thought that might be a hazard to my patients to be still practicing. So when I started thinking about an end game, I thought, well, gee, there's a lot of things I'd like to pass on that I think I've learned about healthcare in the US. So around that time is when I began to develop the idea of writing a book, and I started to collect articles of things I wanted to address. And as I wrote in the interview, that I started to get, I was still working. I wasn't writing yet, but I was starting to gather materials. Anytime something that came across my radar screen that looked like an interesting article that needed to be included, I would email that to myself. And then when it arrived the second time, I'd flag it as a resource for the writing process. When I sat down to write, I retired in April of 20 after 40 years of doing full-time emergency medicine. So I got to start thinking about this book idea. I opened up that folder with the flagged emails. There were over 5,000 flagged emails. So I knew I had a lot of organization to do there.
Amazing. All right, let's move on to the topic of dual perspectives. So you draw from both your 40-year career in emergency medicine, which you just spoke about, and your personal experience as a chronic autoimmune patient. How did these dual perspectives shape the tone and content of your book?
One of the things I learned when I first got ill over 50 years ago, I came down with a condition called ulcerative colitis, one of the inflammatory bowel disease conditions, which at that time was actually seriously considered to be a purely psychosomatic illness, not really having an organic basis, which turned out not to be true. It didn't sound true. It didn't feel right to me. And in the interim, they're pretty convinced it's an autoimmune process triggered off by you probably have a genetic propensity toward it, sense that propensity towards developing it if you have the right environmental exposures or the wrong environmental exposures. So I learned very early in life that there's not everything that we do in healthcare. There's very different degrees of certainty attached to what we do. And so I learned that very intimately with the fact that there was no cure for my condition. There was no known cause.
Okay, thank you for sharing such an intimate part of your life with us, and of course, with your readers of your book. The next question is going to focus on the balancing act. Working in the ED while gathering research sounds incredibly challenging. What strategies did you use to balance your clinical responsibilities with your writing and
But obviously, seeing patients and balancing the needs of the emergency department was always priority number one. But inevitably, you're getting emails and things are coming across your desk, and I'd say, well, that looks interesting. That's something I probably should incorporate into what I want to say in my book. And those are the articles I either made a copy of and brought home with me in physical form, or if they were electronic, I'd forward them to myself. So I didn't let it distract from my work because obviously in the emergency department, that has to be priority number one.
thank you for that. The next question involves the transitioning to writing full time. which a lot of speakers might find interesting. And just to quickly mention that we do have a writers conference, a second annual one, coming up in May 1st through the 4th, and you can access it even after we're done. Once you retired from emergency medicine, you dedicated yourself fully to writing. What were some of the biggest challenges and unexpected rewards that you encountered during that transition?
It turns out I don't really like the writing process because it's a solo process. You're in a room by yourself. And although I managed to get some variation on it, I would thank God for cell phones and the access to the internet. I would often take my dog on long walks through the woods and something would occur to me. I'd say, well, I better look that up. And I'd speak a search into my iPhone and they'd come up with articles or I might even speak a memo, of, gee, when you get around to writing the book, be sure to write about this, that, or the other thing, notes to myself. So, being in the current world where all that stuff is available electronic was a big assistance.
Now, about maintaining engagement, your writing is very direct and supported by data. How do you strike that balance between academic rigor and engaging storytelling to appeal to both professionals and a broader audience?
That was I wanted to get across the scientific aspects, the fact that things are uncertain and what do we do when we find ourselves as patients in a situation of uncertainty? How do we communicate that with our doctors? And as doctors, how do we communicate that and still maintain a level of trust with our physicians? So that was important to me. And during the thinking process of writing the book, I would be matching up patients I had seen and things that went well or either didn't or possibly didn't go well. And how could I have done that better? And so I was trying to match up in my mind what cases that I'd seen went with what concepts I thought were important to address and what articles I was coming across that seemed to address that.
Okay, thank you. Now let's talk about impactful feedback. Have there been any moments when feedback from colleagues or patients significantly influenced your writing process or perspective?
I didn't share my writing with patients or physicians at the beginning. I did have an experience where I did a couple of volunteer trips with the World Health Organization and the CDC in Atlanta. They were during the polio eradication process. And I made an overseas trip first to Pakistan and then to Ghana for several months each time. And the whole process was how to eradicate polio worldwide by screening for potential cases and by encouraging immunization. So during those two trips, I wrote some emails home to people trying to describe the novelty of my situation, especially Pakistan, which was so different from any Western society. When you walk down the street in Pakistan, you cannot make eye contact with a woman. You basically needed to avert your gaze because that was considered insulting and inappropriate. I remember once I was with the local Pakistani public health person I was dealing with. I picked up my camera to take a picture of a landscape. And he immediately reached up and pushed my camera down. I said, "What?" Off in the distance, there were some figures on a camel, riding on a camel. Happened to be women. I couldn't tell, they were so far away, but he knew. And he basically was indicating me, no, you cannot take pictures of women here in Pakistan. So it was such an unusual experience as a Westerner being in such a different culture. So I started writing some emails home to friends and family, trying to convey that. And I found it interesting trying to put into words what I was experiencing. And so that's what gave me the writing bug a little bit. I thought, well, gee, people seem to appreciate what I was saying. It sounds like I'm maybe someone who could put into words what I'm trying to say and get across. So I took that as a challenge. I didn't like the writing process, but what I did like is after having written something and putting it down on paper and rereading it, when you had that feeling when you reread something you write and you say, well, that's what I wanted to say. I really hit it that time. So that was very satisfying to be able to convey something in a way that when you reconsidered it, it seemed to be communicating what you were trying to say.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. So, navigating publishing, you shared with us that after sending out over 100 query emails, you chose a hybrid publishing route. What key lessons did you learn about the publishing process that you'd share with other healthcare professionals looking to write, especially ahead of that writing conference where we're going to congregate as many of us as hopeful writers?
One of the pieces of advice you get if you look, the first thing I did was how do you go about writing a book? And one of the pieces of advice you come across again and again is decide who your audience is and write to those people, which is pretty good. That's pretty good advice. But I said that's not relevant to me. I'm writing about healthcare. Who am I not going to address that to? So I decided that was advice I was just going to completely ignore. I mean, if you're writing a book that's towards a specific audience, you should definitely pay attention to that advice. But I had bigger fish to fry, I thought. I wanted to write something that got patients and physicians on the same page about what obstacles are there to us interacting in a way that's healthy for you as a patient. So I felt I did write to everybody. You're not allowed to say my book is for everybody. You're just not allowed to say that. Well, I said, forget that. That's what I'm going to say, and that's what I'm going to try to do. But fortunately, I came across something different, which I had much greater appeal to me. Someone had written that you should write what you know and write the kind of book you would like to read. So I said, well, I can go with that guidance. So that's the guidance I followed. And when I sit down and reread my book after finishing it, I thought, well, I pretty much hit both of those goals. I wrote what I knew, or at least what I was learning, and wrote the kind of science-based book that I like to read with stories and relevant real life episodes that bring things alive, I think.
Thank you for that advice. So we're going to move on to multimedium storytelling. You've adapted your book into essays and podcasts. How do you decide which medium best serves your message, and what unique advantages have you found in each format?
I've been pretty indiscriminate about saying yes to every opportunity to promote awareness in my book. So I can't say you know, especially if you're working with a small time hybrid publisher like I was, you don't, if you're good enough, if you're a good enough writer and you have that book that you can convince a publisher this book is going to sell a lot of copies, then you can get professionals to tell you how to promote your book. When you don't have that option, you have to kind of invent it on the fly, which is what I've been doing.
Thank you for that. Let's talk about mentorship and inspiration. You admire Abraham Verghese and the value of bedside medicine. How can today's physicians reconnect with that human side of care, even amid tech burnout and systemic pressure?
I don't know what they're emphasizing when they teach the history and physical nowadays in medical school. I would sort of like to attend it and see how much are they emphasizing it. The problem is with dollar driven business decisions, which is really what's running rampant in healthcare now. They're saying, well, don't bother to talk with the patient, don't bother to examine the patient because that takes too much time and you'll see fewer patients. Productivity is what is being given the most emphasis in healthcare nowadays. How many people can you get through in and out the door? Which is fine if you're manufacturing widgets. You want to make as many widgets as you can to be a successful business. We are not as simple as widgets. We are complex biopsychosocial species, and we need to be talked to and we need to be connected with. And that takes time and effort. And one of the things I respect about Dr. Verghese is how much emphasis he placed on that. And I list a couple of simple cases in my book about that. If I had skipped over the history of physical, I would have missed out on things. I mean, I'm sure you can relate to that. There's one funny case was a woman came in said the story was I burned myself because I fell asleep with my heating pad on, and so the nurses hadn't bothered to get her undressed. Patients don't like to get undressed; they just like to get in and out. So she just lifted up her blouse to show me on her flank on where she had burned herself with her heating pad when she fell asleep. It sounded credible up to the point when I took a little bit of closer look and there was some incipient blisters forming on her skin. I said, wait a second now, that doesn't make sense. You're going to sleep through giving yourself basically the equivalent of a second-degree burn? I don't think so. So then I bothered to turn and look, I was going to do it anyway, but I insist on doing a physical exam whether the nurses prepared them for it or not. It means pulling up people's clothes or so then I went around her back and lifted up her shirt to look in the back. She had the classic dermatomal rash of a shingles rash. And so, I mean, it was a perfect story because the ache she was feeling, which she thought was a muscle pull, was the beginning of her shingles outbreak. And had I not bothered to lift up her blouse and see it, and just listen to her story, it would not have been a life-threatening condition, but I could give her a more sensible answer for what she was experiencing. I could give her some antiviral agent to try to shorten the course of her shingles. And that took really, it took just a couple of minutes, but if you skip those couple of minutes, you can miss. And I give a couple other cases in the book where I was on the verge of missing much more dangerous and even life-threatening diagnoses by not taking the time.
Thank you for that. Let's leave off with the final question for aspiring writers. For healthcare professionals who dream of writing but aren't sure where to start, what are the top three actionable steps you would recommend to kick off their writing journey?
I think the easiest place to start is probably by journaling about cases that you saw that you found particularly challenging or intriguing, and things that you had done with that interaction that helped you to come to a right decision, or things that might have been close to causing you to come to a bad decision.
Thank you so much for that. Any final words before we close up this episode?
I would say if you get bit by the bug of, gee, I want to get something down on paper and, obviously start to write. That's what, again, a piece of information you see for aspiring writers is begin to write and see if you like the process. And even if you don't like the process, which I did not, I don't like the process of writing. I don't like being in a room by myself. I'd rather be out and about and doing things. Do it anyway, try to, I would say, be your own critic, reread what you wrote, and then ask yourself, is that what I'm trying to say? And then you can hone your skill.
Thank you, Dr. Remignanti, for joining us in this episode.
Hey, thanks a lot, Donna, for having me along.